The Internet of Things is exploding, and the traffic it's having on carrier networks and in service provider networks is unlike anything we've seen before. It's been compared to smartphones, but it's really very, very different. We're talking today to 3 different solutions providers who will talk about how they are addressing the Internet of Things challenge. People say that the Internet of Things is changing everything. From a network traffic perspective and a network operator perspective, what's changing and how is it going to affect service providers?
I think everything is changing, really, and I'll look at it in a few different ways. The first one is just sheer scale. In the last 10 years, we've put out, carriers worldwide have put out about 6 billion cell phones and smartphones out in the industry. If you look at the projections for IoT, we're talking about 20 billion devices over the next 5 years. So one is the scale is completely different. Second thing that's fundamentally different is, if we look at this from a different prism, there's also a host of new developers that are going to be developing IoT applications. And those applications fall into a number of different verticals, from healthcare to agriculture to critical infrastructure. And those developers that are developing these devices and applications know nothing about the communications network infrastructure, and they're going to have to figure out how to navigate through that to get those devices out and in the network quickly. And the carriers are going to have to figure out, how do I get those devices safely on the network and on the host of different networking technologies that we're looking at, well beyond just cellular.
Let's dig a little more specifically. What can the network operator do today to get ready for that IoT onslaught?
I think the operators can do a few things here. The first thing we need to look at is, if you look at how devices are tested today, and that's the angle we take it at from Spirent, how devices are put on the network and tested so that they're safe for the network and they provide the right user experience for the end customer, there's a significant amount of testing that happens. Some estimates are it costs upwards of $2 million to get a single device on the network. That's never going to scale into IoT. So that's one thing that needs to change. So we're going to have to fundamentally change the way and the types of testing that are done, and we're going to have to deploy some of the technologies really we already see in the IT world. So quick tests, make sure they're safe, these devices are safe to get on the network, is something we're going to have to embrace, and also looking at much more big data analytics to understand how those devices are reacting once they're in the network, as opposed to testing all that in up front.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody draws analogies with smartphones in terms of Internet of Things, but we all know it's not exactly the same. Can you talk to, from the service provider's perspective, how is IoT different from smartphones?
So I think there's a great analogy is the smartphone. Again, it's what we lived with over the last 10 years, and we've seen the smartphone industry really grow up and now get to a point where we're very late in the life cycle, well over 75% penetration everywhere. And I think it's a great place to start from. The first area I'd kind of point to that's different is we're going to have different players in the ecosystem, and the carriers are going to have to deal with that. And that is, we're going to have individual verticals and developers in those verticals building solutions, whether that's in healthcare, agriculture, critical infrastructure, or what have you. And they're going to need tools so they can work within the communications and the carriers' networks. And they're typically not going to be experts in communications. They're going to need ways to get on the network much easier. And you're starting to see that with some of the recent announcements from carriers. How do you make it simple for somebody who may know all about healthcare, but doesn't know that much about communications or how to deal with the carriers? So I think that's one area that's going to be fundamentally different. We're going to have different players, and we're going to have different tools to help them. I think another area that we're going to have to concentrate on is, again, the point I raised earlier about testing. Testing is crucial to get smartphones on the network and make sure they're safe for the network and that their user can really understand the kind of performance they can expect. And that's going to be different in IoT. One is, we're not going to deal with humans anymore. You know, if you look at the smartphone era, what was the smartphone all about? It was all about giving me personally a better experience, number one, and two, satisfying my need from the carrier to give me more and more and more bandwidth. That's fundamentally different because a lot of these sensors may not be where people are, and they don't necessarily need this high bandwidth. So we're going to have to find a way to test this multitude of devices that has a completely different application, a different bandwidth requirements, different location. We're going to have to find a way to do this and cover all this variety in a very quick way. Quickly test, make sure they're safe for the market, and then ensure that we get good performance of those devices going forward.
So let me ask you, how does the standards development work of the MEF help carriers and enterprises get ready for this onslaught of Internet of Things?
Well, I always like to, when we talk about standards, and I say this as the chairman of the Open Cloud Connect Forum, which is part of the MEF, is my favorite thing about standards is, the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. And I think we're going to see that true in the IoT space. Because what we're going to see is a whole proliferation of different standards. Some will be from the cloud perspective and how to support IoT from a cloud perspective. Some will be from more of a device perspective and some protocols like the One M2M initiative. And one of the things we're doing at Spire to help is how can we help build a toolkit for these developers so that we can abstract some of the complications of the standards as they evolve and change as they often do, and we'll hone in on fewer and fewer standards that will really become the keys for IoT and help abstract that from these developers who may not be communication experts.
People say that the Internet of Things is changing everything. From your perspective, what is IoT changing in terms of network traffic and the job of the network operator and service provider?
Well, the Internet of Things is really creating a lot of additional traffic for the network operator. Not so much in terms of the bandwidth of the data traffic, but in terms of the signaling load on the network itself. And so network operators really have a challenge in managing the volume of those sessions from these autonomously connecting devices. And that's where Scenix comes in, because what we deliver is lifecycle service orchestration solutions. And service providers can really use those software tools to effectively, quickly manage that traffic so that the connectivity is always there reliably for the enterprise customers as well as for the consumer customers that rely on reliable Internet of Things connectivity.
Let me drill down a little bit further. What can network operators and service providers do today to get ready for the IoT onslaught?
Well, what network operators can do today is have those management tools in hand so their network operations technicians can quickly and efficiently troubleshoot and monitor those connections 24/7. And what they're doing is they are also installing and taking advantage of network functions virtualization to very cost effectively build out their network and leverage the elasticity of NFV to support the IoT demands. And that also needs another management approach, a management tool that can allow them to visualize and troubleshoot across a hybrid network of both physical and virtual network elements.
So everybody draws analogies with IoT and smartphones, but they're really not the same. How are they different, and how do we need to think differently about IoT and not fall down the trap of thinking it's just a smartphone that's not a phone?
Yeah, that's a great question, because people do equate IoT with consumer devices. But in fact, IoT is predominantly around businesses and enterprises. For example, whether it's vending machines, whether it's trucks, tracking positions of trucks, delivery vehicles, home surveillance, actually more street surveillance, city surveillance, and connected cars and all that. And so to that effect, it's the businesses that are actually placing the more stringent demands on network operators for that reliable connectivity end-to-end from the thing endpoint to the data centers, whether they're private data centers or public or in the cloud. And so that's a very important aspect for an operator to consider and to cater to those enterprise customers that are trying to deliver Internet of Things connectivity.
How does the standards development work of the MEF help enterprises and carriers get ready for the onslaught of the IoT?
Yeah, the MEF is doing great work in terms of defining the capabilities and the interfaces between the various components of a network that carries the IoT traffic. And in particular, where Scenix's interests lie is the definition of lifecycle service orchestration, because that is a really critical component in delivering reliable connectivity for Internet of Things. And they're working with a number of standards bodies, ETSI and ONF, in their MEF Unite initiative to really define clearly the lifecycle service orchestration capabilities. And that will then give operators a great advantage, because they'll be able to pick and choose vendors that comply with those capabilities and with those standards.
People say that the Internet of Things is changing everything. From your perspective, how is it changing network traffic and the jobs of the network operator and service provider?
Well, we in Ericsson have forecasted in our mobility report in 2015 that we will have 26 billion connected devices What that translates to is the incredible amount of data that needs to be now exchanged, and the bandwidth required to exchange that data increases 1,000 times. Now, how can we better than enable the service providers and network operators to cope with the incredible amount of information and data that needs to now be transported across those networks and the cost associated with them? And that's one of the biggest challenges that we see now network operators having, on how to optimize those networks to be able to cope with the cost associated with the bandwidth increase that IoT can potentially bring to them.
Let me dig a little deeper. What can service providers and carriers do today to get ready for the onslaught of IoT devices?
Well, today we're seeing this incredible increase. I think there are technologies that are coming up now, like SDN, network function virtualizations, that they should leverage and embrace as part of the evolution of the network to become more dynamic, more cost effective, to be able to optimize the network dynamically, and to be able to enable new services, because we truly don't know what new services will be in the future. We truly don't know what those devices will be asking the network to do in order to be supported. So I think for us as Ericsson, it's part of our agenda to work with service operators, service providers, and network operators to give them that agility, that speed, and that innovation that they require for the IoT of the future.
Everybody draws analogies between the Internet of Things and smartphones. But we know that in reality, they're really two different things, not just in terms of the form factor, but also in terms of what it means on the network. Can you speak to those differences and give advice as to how network operators and enterprises won't be tricked into thinking that IoT is just...
You're absolutely right. The IoT translates into things and devices that can be connected, not necessarily smart, but there are many different applications for the devices of the future. We give examples such as the connected car. It's not a smartphone, it's a smart car that gets connected to the cloud via the next generation networks. Now, how do we enable those services that will be provided via a car? So network operators today understand the challenges of connecting devices that are either smartphones or not such a smart device. And those devices require different network requirements in order to be more latency sensitive, to have more bandwidth or less bandwidth. For cost points, devices will not be as highly expensive as a smartphone. Maybe it will be $1 device. So how you actually convey the message that we will be able to connect devices that may be costing $1 and transport information through networks that will be charging the price of a smartphone. So all of those challenges need to be addressed as part of the overall ecosystem that needs to be in place in IoT. And network operators need to work with vendors like us that can provide that global reach to any device out there that have the scalability and the maturity of the technology to address and connect all of those devices in a smart way.
Everybody draws analogies between smartphones and the Internet of Things. But in reality, except perhaps to consumers, they're very different, and they're very different in terms of what it means to service providers and carriers. Can you talk about what that means and what advice you would give to enterprises and carriers in terms of thinking about IoT differently than smartphones?
Absolutely. Ericsson works very closely with operators connecting devices, connecting enterprises, connecting homes. In the future, we're looking at new type of IoT connectivity like cars. The type of services and the type of connections that a car will require, the smart car will require, are very different, and on the network requirements that will be there in order to service a device like a smartphone. Or if we're looking at examples like healthcare, for instance, the type of devices are mission critical, for healthcare, will require a whole different set of needs from the network: reliability, scalability, time-sensitive, mission-critical actions that will need a network provider or a service provider to offer different type of services in order to enable those IoT devices that are mission critical. So we have to look at all of those different dynamics that are ongoing as part of the IoT world that they don't necessarily match the same level of requirements that a device like a smartphone will be required. So we don't know what's coming in the future, but we for surely know that we need to be prepared for different cost points, for global reachability, for scalability, for being able to offer new services that we still don't know what they are. So that's part of the collaboration that we need to have between service providers as well as the vendors that are enabling new technologies to get them to where they want to be in IoT.
So how does the standards work being done by the MEF help carriers and service providers prepare for the IoT onslaught?
It's enabling all those carriers and network providers to reach the cost points that are needed in order to become more agile, more cross-carrier collaboration that needs to happen to support the plethora of IoT devices that will be out there. We don't know where all of these devices will be located across the globe. So all of these providers also need to collaborate with each other. And MEF is working specifically on standardizing communications, information models across the way we communicate between carriers, multiple carriers across multiple networks, multiple worlds and countries out there. So as part of the work ongoing and collaboration that we're doing with the MEF, involves the normalization of the network across many domains and many carriers in order for us to drive the cost points that will be required for some of those IoTs that may cost $1 in the future.
The Internet of Things is here, it's growing fast. As we've heard, things like testing, standards development, increased use of secure networks, these are all key to making the IoT really successful. It's exciting to hear what these vendors and solutions providers have to say, and I'm anxious to see what they come up with next.